Chapter 5 of Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Leeson. Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. Chapter 5. Lepanto, 1571. Part 2. The 6 galleasses represented a new type, a link between the oared ships of the past and the sailing fleets of the immediate future. They were heavy, three-masted ships, with rounded bows, and their upper works built with an inward curve so that the width across the bulwarks amidships was less than that of the gun deck below. The frames of warships were built on these lines till after Nelson's days. This "tumble home of the sides," as it was called, was adopted to bring the weight of the broadside guns nearer the center line of the ship and so lessen the leverage and strain on her framework. The guns had first been fired over the bulwarks, but at a very early date portholes were adopted for them. The galleass had a high forecastle and poop, each with its battery of guns, pointing ahead, astern, and on each side. Other guns were mounted on the broadsides in the waist of the ship, and to command the main deck, in case an enemy's boarders got possession of it, lighter guns were mounted on swivels at the back of the forecastle and on the forepart of the poop. Compared to the low, crowded galley, the galleass was a roomy and much more seaworthy ship. She was generally a slow sailer, but in order to enable her to make some progress, even in calms or against a head wind, and so work with a fleet of galleys, she had a rower's deck, under her main or gun deck, and on each side 12 or 15 oars of enormous length, each worked by several men. She had the drawbacks of most compromises. She could not sail as well as the frigate, and her speed with the oar was much less than that of the galley. But the gain was that she could be used as a floating battery, carrying many more guns than the few pieces mounted in the galley's bows. The galleass's guns were high above the water, and the galleys dreaded their plunging fire. Each of Don Juan's 6 galleasses carried some 30 guns of various calibers, and to defend their high sides against an attack by boarders, their fighting men were chiefly arquebusiers. In order to fuse the triple fleet of the Allies into one armada, and to avoid the risk of international jealousies, Don Juan proceeded to form his galleys into 5 squadrons, each made up of ships selected from the 3 fleets, so that none of these divisions could claim to act only for Rome or Spain or Venice. The organization of the Christian armada may be thus summed up in tabular form. Division, Vanguard. Commander, Juan de Cardona. Galleys, 7. Main line of battle. Division, left wing. Commander, Agustina Barbarigo. Galleys, 53. Division, center. Commander, Don Juan de Austria. Galleys, 62. Division, right wing. Commander, Giovanni Andrea Doria. Galleys, 50. Division, reserve. Commander, Alvaro de Bazan, Marquis de Santa Cruz. Galleys, 30. Total galleys, 202. Sailing ships. Galleasses, 6. Frigates, 70. Total sailing ships, 76. These frigates sailed during the voyage as a separate squadron under Don Cesar de Avalos. They were employed as storeships and tenders. Total, 202 galleys plus 76 sailing ships, equals 278 ships in all. It is interesting to note that instead of choosing one of the large sailing vessels as his flagship, Don Juan displayed his flag, the standard of the League, from the masthead of the largest of the Spanish galleys, the Reale, a splendid ship built for the Viceroy of Catalonia 3 years before. She had 60 oars, a battery of guns pointing forward through a breastwork in the bow, and another gun on her high poop pointing over her stern, which was adorned with elaborate wood carvings, the work of Vasquez of Seville, one of the most famous sculptors of the day. She had a crew of 300 rowers and 400 fighting men. In the battle line 2 other great galleys were to lie to right and left of the Reale, on her starboard the flagship of Colonna, the papal admiral, and to port that of Veniero the Venetian, flying the lion banner of St. Mark. Next to these were the galleys of the princes of Parma and Urbino. On the extreme right of the centre was the post of the flagship of the Knights of Malta, commanded by the Grand Master Giustiniani. All the galleys of the central squadron flew blue pennons as their distinguishing flag. The vanguard and the right flew green triangular flags. When the line was formed Cardona and his 7 galleys were to take post on the left or inner flank of the right division. Doria, the Genoese admiral, was on the extreme right. The left flew yellow pennons. Its admiral was the Venetian Barbarigo, a veteran of many a hard-fought campaign. Santa Cruz, the admiral of the reserve squadron, was posted in the middle of his line, flying his flag on board the Capitana or flagship of the Neapolitan squadron. All the flagships had as a distinctive mark a long red pennon at the foremast head. 28,000 fighting men were embarked on the fleet. The Italian soldiers were the most numerous, then came the Spaniards. There were about 2,000 of other nationalities, chiefly Germans. The Venetian galleys were rather short of fighting men, and to remedy this weakness Veniero, though with some reluctance, consented to receive on board of them detachments of Don Juan's Spanish infantry. On almost every ship there were serving a number of young gentlemen volunteers. To give a list of their names and of the commanders of galleasses and galleys and detachments of troops embarked would be to draw up a roll of the historic names of Italy and Spain. Lepanto might well be described as not only the closing battle of crusading days, but the last battle of the age of chivalry. And, strange to say, on board of one of Colonna's galleys, acting as second in command of its fighting men, there was a young Spaniard who was to laugh Europe out of its chivalry, Don Miguel Cervantes Saavedra, author of Don Quixote, some 30 years later. At the end of the first week of September the fleet was ready for sea, but the start was delayed by bad weather. For several days a storm raged in the Straits of Messina, accompanied by thunder and lightning and torrents of rain. At length, on the 14th, the sky cleared and the sea went down. Next day Don Juan sent off the squadron of frigates under the command of Don Cesar de Avalos, with orders to proceed to Taranto and await the main body of the fleet there. At sunrise on the 16th the great fleet left Messina. The Reale led the way. The tall galleasses were towed out by the galleys. It took some hours for the whole armada to clear the harbour, then, on the admiral's signal, they set their sails, and with wind and oar steered south-westward across the straits. The first day's voyage was only a few miles. Don Juan was taking the opportunity of reviewing his fleet, and testing his arrangements for its formation. Each captain had his written orders giving his position when under way and in the line of battle. It was in this formation the fleet anchored along the Italian coast beyond Reggio, on a front of 5 miles. Next day the fleet rounded Cape Spartivento, the toe of Italy, and after an attempt to continue the voyage on the 19th, was forced by bad weather to put back and anchor under shelter of the land for some 24 hours. As the weather improved, Don Juan decided not to coast round the Gulf by Taranto, but to lay his course from Cape Colonna for Cape Santa Maria, the heel of Italy, and then across the opening of the Adriatic to Corfu. A frigate was sent to inform de Avalos of the change of plans, and the armada, helped by a favouring wind, stood out to sea and for a while lost sight of land. It was known that the Turkish fleet had concentrated in or near the opening of the Gulf of Corinth. It might also have put to sea, and Don Juan took precautions in view of a possible encounter during his voyage. Cardona, with his 7 swift galleys of the vanguard, was directed to keep 20 miles ahead during the daytime, closing in to a distance of only 8 miles at sunset, and increasing the interval again at dawn. The 3 squadrons of the main body appear to have been formed each in line ahead, the leading ships, those of the admirals, at the head of each squadron, with such lateral intervals between the columns that line of battle could be formed by the ships coming up to right and left of their flagships. Santa Cruz with the reserve acted as a rear guard, and was to assist any vessel that might be in difficulties. The rear ship of each squadron was to display a large lantern at the masthead after dark. The admiral's ship was distinguished by 3 large lanterns. 40 galleys were detached to bring reinforcements of infantry from Taranto and Gallipoli. 4 swift galleys under the command of Gil d'Andrada were sent on in advance to obtain information of the Ottoman fleet. From Cape Santa Maria the course was set for the Ionian Islands. On the morning of 24 September, Through the driving rain that accompanied a heavy thunderstorm, the lookouts of the vanguard could distinguish the chain of islands north of Corfu, the islets of Merlera, Fano.